So we've reached the last lecture in this class, and you all had the opportunity to choose between atheistic existentialism or Christian existentialism. Surprisingly, y'all chose Christian existentialism. So that is what we're going to be exploring today. A few general notes before we begin. Existentialism is all about the big questions of human life. Why are we here? Is there a meaning or purpose to our lives? Does free will exist? Can we actually do things of our own volition? How much of our lives is determined by the time and place and context into which we are born? All of these questions is what existentialism is trying to deal with. Now, the first existentialists, I believe, besides Nietzsche, were spiritually or religiously inclined. What we see is that those who are wrestling with some of these primary and fundamental problems of human life are doing so in the context of the religion of Christianity, especially Kierkegaard and Eastern Orthodox thinkers like the guy we're looking at today. But this is a field that has grown and evolved over the last few centuries, and one that has kind of split into two different branches: Christian existentialism and atheistic existentialism. I'm going to talk about one of its prominent figures, that is Jean-Paul Sartre, later in the lecture, but we're going to be focusing on an existentialism that tries to ground the purpose and meaning of human life in the existence and attributes of God and what His plan is for us. So if you don't have an inclination towards believing in God, or if you don't think that God exists, this may not be extremely convincing for you, but nevertheless, I think there are some gems of wisdom here that we can mine that might inform your life, that you might use in order to, well, find some kind of happiness and fulfillment. So the thinker we're looking at today is Nikolai Berdyaev. He was a Russian Eastern Orthodox writer, philosopher, and theologian. Rebel, you might say. He opposed authority during his time. He was arrested, I believe, a number of times for his unwillingness to bow to the authorities. But he's somebody who is struggling very deeply with, again, some of these fundamental questions. How the hell are we supposed to live? What is it that we're supposed to be doing? He's coming at it from a very poetic and emotional, spiritual space, though. This is not somebody who's going to provide a rational, logical, 100% reasonable argument. This is somebody who is going to argue for their beliefs and their worldview, but somebody who does so romantically, idealistically, you might say, moved by deep emotion and passion and zeal for the stuff of human life and what makes it possible. In that way, you might say he is similar to Rousseau, who we looked at earlier in this class, right? Somebody who wrote with a lot of passion and emotion. And the kind of worldview that he's going to be giving us today is very mystical in its properties. This is not the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who is trying to, again, operates like a cold calculating machine. But somebody who is introspecting, somebody who is reaching deep within his own heart in order to divine the origins and nature and truths of the cosmos. Now, you may have been turned off when I told you that this was a Christian existentialist view. But One thing that you need to understand about Eastern Orthodoxy and the thinker that we're looking at today is their understanding of Christianity is probably very different than yours. In the West, a lot of Christians are Protestant or come from Protestant denominations. Or they are Catholic, right? And they follow the Catholic Church and the Pope. Eastern Orthodoxy is a very different kind of Christianity. It's one that has an entirely different metaphysic, soteriology, eschatology, a different conception of the person of Jesus Christ and the nature of God. It differs in very important ways from both Protestant and Catholic theology. One of the ways that we're going to see that in Berdyaev's work today is how he describes God. In Catholicism and Protestantism, thinkers and theologians have always attached positive attributes to God, right? Oh, God is all powerful. He's all good. He's everywhere, right? He is perfect. He is just. He is merciful, so on and so forth. A lot of people who are mystically inclined, a lot of Eastern Orthodox thinkers are going to say, all of those positive attributes miss the mark. They do not generally engage in what is called positive theology, where they attach positive attributes or descriptors to God. Instead, they engage in what we might call negative theology or apophatic theology. According to these guys, any positive attribute that you attach to God is incorrect because God expands beyond any category, concept, or word. Similar to how we spoke of the Tao when we looked at Alan Watts' piece. The Tao was not something that can be defined or described. It's not something that can be grasped or conceptualized. Because it is bigger than that. It's more meaningful. No category or descriptor or word can capture what it is or what it means. The same is true of God, Berdyaev is going to say. So we can only say, truthfully, what God is not. God is not evil. God is not bad. God is not sinful. God is not finite. These would be more accurate ways to describe ultimate reality, or the divine, according to these thinkers. So what does this have to do with philosophy of life? The name of this unit, life, being, and death, what we've been looking at these last few weeks. Well, according to Berdyaev, what Christianity offers us, if understood properly, is a path out of our miserable lives, out of our hellish existences, into fulfillment and salvation. Although, as we're going to see, it's going to differ from a lot of the Christian stories that you've heard about how the universe works and how we ought to be living. What Berdyaev is going to stress in this book, The Destiny of Man, is the amazing capacity of human beings to utilize their free will in various ways, to change their lives, to make a different choice, to escape their circumstances, to engage in free and creative expression, and to bring new things into existence. He's going to say that's what life is all about, and that's what the Christian message is trying to tell us. We are called to be co-creators with God, bringing new stuff into existence. That means artwork. That means new values. That means not allowing ourselves to be held down and enslaved to rules and norms. Which is probably a very different way of thinking about this, considering in the past you've heard Christianity has said, obey the 10 Commandments, you have to follow these rules. Well, he's going to say, You need to follow the rules perhaps at the start, but the goal is not to perfectly follow the rules. The goal is to get to a point where you follow the spirit of the rules without being enslaved to these artifacts of good and evil, these norms, these laws, these principles. Sonchev once said that in Berdyaev's philosophy, the four pillars that his philosophy is based on is freedom, creativity, person, and communion. And what he meant by this was that the fulfilled, happy life is one that is active and creative, in which we're doing things, in which we're bringing new stuff into existence, exercising our divine capacities, you might say. One which utilizes our free will. One that tries to grow and transform the human person towards becoming better, towards becoming more creative, stronger, wiser. And one that is oriented towards communion with what he considered to be ultimate reality, which is God. That is what we are called to do. In this book specifically, The Destiny of Man, Berdyaev is doing a lot of things. He's trying to describe the nature of human beings, what our relationship is to God, where we came from, where we are going, what the hell we're supposed to be doing here. That's what he's trying to get to the bottom of. Now, obviously, he's going to advocate for a Christian metaphysic. Although, again, this metaphysic is going to be a little bit different than probably what you have heard of before. He believes that God exists, although, again, no positive descriptor can be accurately applied to him, because God extends beyond that stuff. God is infinite. Our capacity to truly grasp and understand God is extremely limited. He considers the planet that we are living on right now in our mortal existence, history, as being just one stage in the cosmic evolution of the universe. He talks about what life was like before the fall. He talks about what life was like after that. He has a very symbolic, metaphorical understanding of what happened according to this story. But what we are going through right now is basically just one phase in God's overarching plan for the universe, he believes. What God ultimately is seeking to do, he argues, is give us opportunities to draw closer to him, to strengthen our creative capacities and utilize them, but ultimately to transform the world around us such that it is closer to our idealized image of heaven than it is of hell. He thinks that human beings aren't just physical things, like tables or chairs or blinds or coffee mugs. But rather, he says that we are social beings and we are spiritual beings. What that means is that we have free will. We can engage in free activity. We can decide how we want to live, because part of us, or the important part of ourselves, exists outside of the natural causal order. But also, we are influenced by the society, the history, the economic structures of the time in which we live. And so constantly there is this tension. There's a tension between social influence and what we individually want to do and how we want to live our lives. There's a spiritual tension from falling into non-being, and, well, becoming more real and being full. And we'll talk about that as we go through the lecture today. It is up to us to decide how we want to live, but what he's going to try to present for us is a positive path, a positive vision. In contrast to some of the other thinkers of his time, he thought that being spiritual beings, engaging in philosophical inquiry and reflection and coming to know the nature of the universe, well, that is a spiritual experience. Knowledge isn't just passive consumption of information. Rather, he describes revelation, or coming to knowledge, as something that illuminates the world, as something that changes the nature of reality around us. The kind of life that this involves, knowing and being a light kind of for reality and transforming reality around us through our actions, through our knowledge, that is how we are supposed to be living. That's what it's about. It involves activity. It involves interacting with other people. It involves going out there and actually doing things. In this way, we might liken his idealized conception of the human life to what Aristotle had to say when he argued that the happy, fulfilled life is one of activity. It's one in which we are doing things. The sense that you get when you read this book is that Berdyaev is someone who has deeply suffered in his life, who, like Kierkegaard, is a philosopher who has deeply wrestled with some of the questions, the primary questions of human existence, and has not come out unscathed. In the first 2 chapters of this book, he brings up time and again how tragic human life is, how there is suffering, how there is pain. Things do not go the way that we want them to. People betray us. We break our bones, we stub our toes, we lose our loved ones to death. We too will die someday. And if that wasn't bad enough, there are all these conflicts in our lives. Yes, when our expectations aren't met, that's sad. Yes, when somebody we love dies, that's sad. But in trying to do good, in trying to be a good person, Berdyaev says that is where the tragedy exists most deeply. Have you ever made a hard ethical decision? There were 2 choices in front of you, and you didn't know which one was the right one, but you could come up with arguments for both, right? Well, this might be the right path, this seems like a good thing to do, but also this seems like the good thing to do. Because we live in a fallen world, Berdyaev says, there are all these conflicts between our values, between our desires, between our ideas about what's good. And that is where the true tragedy lies. He asks a very interesting question. Is there truly good in goodness? Which is supposed to invoke for us this idea of even doing the right thing may bring about a lot of pain and suffering and tragedy for yourself and other people. This makes our human existence full of despair, full of tragedy. Yes, we may suffer evil in suffering, but even in doing good, we also suffer. And there is also tragedy. Yet, it is our choice whether or not to sink into and become complacent in that tragedy and that suffering. Just like Jean-Paul Sartre would say, we all have the opportunity at any time to decide how we want to live and how we want to react to the world around us. We are not determined to think or do certain things. We have a free will. And so although our lives are riddled with these tragedies and paradoxes and all of this suffering, Berdyaev says, it is not the fulfilled life that gives into all that despairs, that becomes nihilistic. Rather, our task is to boldly confront what lies right in front of us. The problems, the trials, and the tribulations of life. It's to boldly confront the tragedy and the suffering. To use our creative capacities to come up with solutions to these problems that face us. To create new values. To create new things. To express ourselves. Ultimately, this is what we are meant to do. Through free creative activity, we can draw ourselves closer to ultimate reality, what is perfect, what is divine. And we will be able to weather the storm. This is what's going to bring fulfillment and happiness. And this is what his philosophy is all about. So, does anybody have any questions so far? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep on trucking here. Okay. I asked you to read for today just chapter 2 of this book. And I know it was long, but I think it does a good job of explaining his general philosophy. In this book, Berdyaev argues that we live in a universe in which there is good and evil. There is right and wrong. There is pleasure and there is suffering. In order to describe for us what our condition is like, our human condition, what we are facing down, he has to go back to some of the fundamental stories of the Bible, he thinks. He describes the story of the fall. What happened before it, what happened after it, and how that has transformed our universe and human consciousness. He notes that traditional Christian doctrines, do not do a good job of really understanding what the fall is about and what it has done to us, and how it has transformed the reality around us. You've heard the story, right? Adam and Eve are living in the garden, right? God has created everything at this point, and he says, don't eat from these trees in the garden, or you will die. And who comes up to them and is like, hey, are you sure God said that? Are you sure you want to listen to him? You surely won't die. No, God doesn't want you to eat it because actually you'll become like him. And they are tempted into eating the fruit. God finds out. They try to hide from him. No good. Sin has now entered the world, and with it, death, according to this story. But understood from the traditional Christian point of view, you might have a lot of questions about this, and you might be very angry at God. Why? Well, just think about it a little bit. God knew all of this was going to happen before He created the universe, right? If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, He knew that Adam and Eve were going to disobey, right? And plunge the rest of humanity into sin and suffering and death. And so you might then ask, well, what was the point of it all? Why did God allow this to happen when He knew that it was going to happen? Why did He give humanity free will in the first place if He knew they were going to use it in this terrible way? And damn all of these people after them, right? What's the deal, God? It might cause you to believe that He's either not all-powerful or not all good, right? That He's actually evil, or that He's bad, or that He doesn't love us. This is the sense that we get from the traditional doctrine. Sure, some theologians have responded to this by saying, well, God allows evil to exist because through evil He can do good, and the sufferings of life serve as good tests for us that we can use to grow our faith, and free will, that humans have free will, matters to God more than that they be happy and free of sin and free of evil. But not a lot of people have found this convincing, right? After all, if God knew all of this was going to happen, you could say, God is responsible for everything that has happened, including all of the people who are going to be damned to hell because they never heard about Jesus, or because of the actions of Adam and Eve. And these people think to themselves, there's so many things that God could have done differently. Thus, either He doesn't exist, or He's not good, or we have all these reasons to think that the Christian story is stupid and it's bad. Berdyaev says in this conception, this traditionalist conception, he calls this whole snafu a divine play that God plays with Himself. Because after all, He's responsible for all of it. He could have intervened, and He didn't. But Berdyaev has a different conception. He does not think that God created humans with free will. Rather, he thinks, strangely, that human beings are the product of two sources. What we might call God and nothing. That generative void that we discussed when we looked at Taoism. According to Berdyaev, humanity is a product of the divine creator God and what he calls the Ungrund, or the absolute, or the capital N nothing. The reason why God is not ultimately responsible for what Adam and Eve decided to do with their free will and their disobedience is because He did not create the capacity for free will within them. Rather, where we get our free will is not from God, it is from this mysterious generative void that underlies all being. Very strange mystical view, right? We cannot describe it, we cannot see it. And yet it was from this divine nothing, or this void, that the triune God actually emerged from. Thus, the traditionalist conception is not something that Berdyaev believes in. Rather, humans are a product of both God and non-being. And that is where our freedom comes from. We have the seeds of nothing or the seeds of non-being inside of us. Or you might say something like a portal or a gate to this generative void within us. That forms a very part of our being, of our spiritual being. And thus it's always open to us to be able to do good actions or evil actions, to utilize our free will as we see fit, to obey God or disobey God, to live kind of whatever life that we want to live. In some sense, this is what it means to be human, is to have this capacity for free will, for free thought. God does not have control over what we do through our free will. God has control over being. He has control over created things, but He does not have control over non-being or nothing or what is not created. Berdyaev thinks that in contrast to traditional Christianity, Protestant and Catholic Christianity, which humiliates humans, which says you are completely sinful, you are depraved, you are given over to this evil will and all these bad desires, you must repent, you are terrible. He thinks that actually, if we understand correctly what's going on, human beings are incredible creatures who have a divine capacity to reject God if they wish to, or to walk with Him. This is the incredible ability that we have, he thinks, in contrast to everything else in the universe. Animals don't have this capacity. They're just moved by their instincts and their impulses and their desires. But we have the capacity for reflection, free thought, free activity. We can do whatever the hell we want. What God ultimately wants us to do, Berdyaev thinks, is to utilize this free will to create things with Him and to transform non-being, to bring new stuff into existence, just like He did at the beginning of our universe, and which He continues to do in His own way. Berdyaev says God longs for His friend. But it is up to us to decide whether or not we are going to be that for Him. In the traditional Christian worldview or conception, Berdyaev says, people conceive of God as being static, as being this thing that doesn't change, right? As being fixed. And you will have heard this view if you were raised in a Catholic or Protestant household, right? Or if you went to church. Does God's will change? Does God ever become, different than what He was yesterday? A lot of people would say no. But Berdyaev says this is such a limited, mistaken concept of what God is actually experiencing, what the Trinity is experiencing. He thinks that, like humans, God experiences dramatic shifts in His divine life. Emotionally, we might say. God goes through emotional changes. He may experience anger or despair, love, regret, for how everything is going, for how all of this is turning out. Berdyaev thinks he has emotional and affective desires. He has a more complex nature than we originally thought. There is tragedy in God's life, he says, and he suffers with us. Why? Because he can see the evil in the world that is the result of people's free choices. He sees the pain. He sees the betrayal. He sees the death, the violence, the deceit, the dishonesty, and he feels for us. He feels for us as beings who have to go through these tragic experiences because of what other people are thinking and doing. And ultimately, he longs for us to live with him, to be with him, to be in a relationship with him. Although again, this is something that it is up to us to decide. In our universe, he says, there are three fundamental principles that are in tension, that decide how things go. There's providence. God is having a hand in some things and he's watching over stuff. There's what he calls fate. You might call this the laws of nature, the physical laws of the universe, right? There are certain laws and principles baked into how this stuff works and how it's going to go. We are affected by that. We are affected by what God is doing. But we in the universe are also influenced by the free will of people. So, in what happens, these principles are in tension, in competition, you might say sometimes, to influence and decide what happens and how things are going to go. We don't have control over all of these, but we do have the capacity to do a lot. We can place ourselves in certain situations. We can work on ourselves. We can forgive and show kindness if we wish. Certain things will inevitably happen to our bodies. Those are subject to the whims and processes of fate, being physical, being natural. But in real existential fashion, what we think, how we react to the world around us, what we do, this is within our control. And so he says, if we're going to understand humans' place in the cosmos, if we're going to understand the human condition and formulate a kind of philosophy of life, we need to understand how all this stuff got here. We need to understand what is it that ails humans? What are we suffering from? And how can we get away from that? To do this, he tries to discuss the origins of good and evil. Because since this distinction entered the world, everything has been different for us. He says that good and evil entered the world with the fall. But he's not talking merely about a historical event. He's talking about a dramatic shift in human consciousness and human perception. According to him, what happened through the fall? What happened because of this? Well, a few different things. Prior to the fall, Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony with God. And what he says is, they didn't have a conscious mind. Rather, they lived at oneness with God and the garden that He had created for them. And they lived in harmony with that, equilibrium with that. But it was as if, well, they didn't really think about their situation too much. They didn't really exercise their capacity for reflection and free thought. We might say that they were living rather unconsciously, instinctively, impulsively in line with God's will. In this state, humanity was living in paradise. They didn't experience any problems because they were, in some sense, at one with their surroundings and the will of God. There wasn't a separation between their own thoughts and their own wills and what God was experiencing and what He was doing and what the animals and the plants were doing. But when they decided to disobey God and they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, He says this produced in humanity a divided consciousness. What is our mind like now? We have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind, right? We have an area of our being, of our mind that we are aware of. And we have a whole other part of our mind that influences what we do, but is not integrated with our conscious experience and with our reflection. So, with the fall, a divided consciousness sprung up in humans. With the fall, he also says, good and evil entered the world. And his point is very deep here. He doesn't just mean that sin entered the world. He means, due to the fall, humans gained the ability to value or devalue things, to think things are good and to think things are bad. With the fall, valuation and distinction entered the world. This is a radical break from how the universe operated before Adam and Eve made this decision. Because prior to that, everything existed in harmony and equilibrium. There wasn't really any firm, ultimate distinctions between things. There was just this harmonious system working together, ordered. No chaos. But after the fall, that all changed. Humanity no longer lived in oneness with God and the order that He created. We split ourselves off from that. We gained the ability to say or think things are good and bad, to morally distinguish between events and actions and things. And thus he says, man rejected the bliss and wholeness of Eden and chose the pain and tragedy of cosmic life in order to explore his destiny to its inmost depths. And what he means by this was that the fall was at once a progression along the path of humanity and a regression at the same time. It was a regression because through the fall, humanity rejected the paradise and rejected the oneness that they were experiencing. Stuff became fragmented. There was difference, there was distinction, there was goodness and badness, whereas before the fall, there was no goodness and badness. There was just what was, and it was perfect. But through this action, humanity moved away from being in tune with God's created order and His will, but at the same time, humanity gained a capacity that they didn't have before. They gained the capacity for valuation, for reflective thought. Paradoxically, then, our consciousness changed, but this was both a good and a bad thing. Bad because consciousness is what allows us to suffer in the first place. Think about it. If you were an animal and you couldn't reflect on your life, how much would you really suffer? What causes you suffering in your life? Do you have a hard time turning your brain off at night? Are you worried about stuff? Are you anxiously scared about the future and what's going to happen to you? Your mind is running through all these possibilities, right? It is your capacity for consciousness that causes you to have all this worry and anxiety and stress and expectation and disappointment. Yet at the same time, although it opens the door to suffering and allows for suffering, it also clues us in to how we can transcend that suffering. That is why Berdyaev thinks that, well, although this event has some bad qualities to it, some bad aspects, it has also allowed us to, explore destiny in our own lives for ourselves. Fulfillment, he says, is going to come once we are whole again. But the way to wholeness is not back into non-being. Tell me, are you going to be happy and fulfilled if you just try to escape all of the sufferings of life through drugs and alcohol and melatonin? Is that the way to wholeness? That may be how we are living, but the majority of people are going to say no. That is not the path to fulfillment. So the path to happiness and fulfillment is not downwards into non-being. It is not through deadening your consciousness, through escapism. Rather, it is up. It is boldly upwards, further into being, into perfection, into transcendence. And we can use our new capacity for consciousness to get there. We can use our consciousness to get there in tandem with our creative capacity. To bring new stuff into the world. To create new philosophies. To transform the society around us. To strike out on our own. To decide for ourselves how we want to live. Thus, he thinks the story of the fall really exalts us rather than humiliates us. We are the only things in existence who, besides God, has any control over what their fate and destiny is going to be. We can rise against God if we wish. We can separate ourselves more fully from Him. Or we can do the opposite. That is up to us. An incredible ability that we have. But Berdyaev warns, separating yourself from God, engaging in destructive actions, plunging yourself into escapist modes of living, drugs and alcohol, or orienting your stuff around the things of this world, ultimately what you will be engaged in is the creation of your own personal hell. Thus, religion and society and all these different people are going to give you ideas about how to live, about what to do, about how to get where you want to go. But do you want to know what Berdyaev and Sartre, for example, are going to stress? Do not become a slave to those rules and norms. Yes, society conditions you and pressures you into thinking and living a certain way. But if you just allow yourself to become completely determined by that stuff, you are not living. You're acting like an atom or an apple or an animal. This is why I saved this lecture to the end of this class. This whole time, I have not been trying to tell you how to live. I've not been giving you what I think is the accurate view of the world. What have I been doing? I've been trying to give y'all as many perspectives as possible so that you can think through them, so that you can reflect on them. This is what philosophy is all about. Recall what we talked about on the very first day. Philosophy is love of wisdom. You are never going to be wise if you don't actually think about how the world works for yourself. If you just accept what people tell you. If you just accept the rules. If you really want to be a fulfilled person, Berdyaev is going to say, and Sartre, you have to follow your own will and desires. Yes, there are going to be consequences for your actions, right? If you live in society and you decide, I'm going to follow my free will today, I feel like killing someone. Yeah, you're going to suffer consequences, right? There are always consequences for actions. But the point that these philosophers are trying to make, is trying to get you to realize, is that how you see the world, how you interpret it, and how you act within it is at the end of the day all up to you. Let's say I approach you and I tell you, oh, my student, I've been hearing the voice of God. God tells me to give you an A. You might be thinking to yourself, what the hell is Professor Gunnar talking about? Has he gone crazy? I knew he was a little kooky. I didn't know he was this bad. Well, let me ask you, is there any proof that I could give you that would convince you that God is talking to me? Is there any proof that I could give myself? Is there ultimately any proof of anything? Besides perhaps mathematical theorems. What you value, what you believe, what you do, ultimately all of this stuff is a function of your own will. How you interpret this class, the value that it has for you, whether or not it's going to inform your life moving forward. All of this is dependent on choices that you are making in your mind and out there in the world. That is what the existentialists are trying to get us to realize. At every point in time, we are deciding to affirm or reject what is going on and what we're being told, what we believe in and what we value. And so Berdyaev would say, you need to think hard about this yourself. You need to utilize your free will to deal creatively with the problems that life throws at you. These religions and these ideologies and these philosophies of life, they'll give you all of these rules, all of these things that you're supposed to value. The point, he's going to say, is to not follow that stuff blindly. The point is, in some sense, to create the world that you want to live in. To choose the values that are meaningful to you. To create new ones. Ones that are actually going to deal and address the complex nature of our reality that is constantly changing, that is evolving. That's what we are called to do, ultimately. We have to deal with the choices of other free beings, like other humans. We have to deal with God's providence. God has to deal with our stuff. And we could roll over, we could just give up, we could submit ourselves to some idea or rule or ideology or philosophy, but that would not be truly living. We are not essentially sinful and screwed to live a sufferable existence. We have within us the ability to start new things, to respond how we want to the situations of life. From our limited point of view, we might look out at the world and we might think that it's bad. We might think that it's evil. We might think God is evil. But again, this is kind of a choice that we are making. This is an attitude that we are taking, right? And that we are applying to the world around us. In all honesty, Berdyaev is going to say, God is beyond good and evil. Our descriptors of good and evil wouldn't even apply to him. Or whatever the hell he is. Maybe describing him as a him is off base. And if the world is not the way that we want it to be, we can change it. And if we are not how we want to be, we can change that. One of the most stark and interesting ideas that he puts forth later in this book is what he thinks heaven and hell actually are. If we follow the philosophy of Arendt, and if we follow Berdyaev, heaven and hell have a lot more to do with our experience of reality than they are metaphysical places that we will go to after we die. In some very real way, he thinks humans construct their own heavens and hells. It has everything to do with how you are interpreting the world, how you're thinking, and how you're acting. When you act in ways that are destructive, when you think negatively, when you are a defeatist or you're nihilistic, and you're wishing to just escape from everything and leave it all behind, you're pursuing non-being and creating your own personal hell that you will live through. We all know what it's like to experience hell. The suffering, the torment that seems unending. But it doesn't have to be that way. Heaven and hell are not these metaphysical places that we're going to go to after we die. Rather, they are a function of how we are interpreting and experiencing the world around us. You could say they are spiritual, experiential states. That is what heaven and hell are. And insofar as we have free will, we can create heaven for ourselves. We can make the world more like how we think heaven is or should be. That is available to us. And so ultimately, Berdyaev's message, I think, is hopeful. I think it is positive. Yes, there is despair and suffering in life. But it doesn't have to be like that for you or for other people. You don't have to see the world in that way. You don't have to experience it that way. We forget that we can kind of do whatever the hell we want because we get weighed down and scared by people's views of us, because we're trying to live up to others' expectations, because there are all of these laws and policies, right, and structures that we think we are powerless against. But that is not true. Ultimately, it is up to us to create the world that we want to inhabit. We will find happiness and fulfillment if we creatively approach the problems of the world. If we express ourselves, if we bring new things into existence. That is kind of our divine calling at the end of the day. It's only this free and creative activity that will bring about our existential salvation. If we just throw our hands up, if we give in, if we make ourselves a servant to what is happening around us, or a slave to what is happening, or the rules or the laws, nothing is ever going to change. So what are you going to do? How do you want the world to be? Are you doing anything now to push it in that direction? Are you doing anything now to improve your own situation? What existentialism reminds us is that we are not powerless creatures. We have so much more control over our lives than we realize. As for me, well, I think I'm going to keep on trying to teach. I love doing that. But if that's not in the cards, I'll pivot and I'll try something else. Your life, no doubt, is not perfect. You have troubles and sorrows. But whether or not you stay in that, remain in that, that is up to you. You have free will. Use it. If that means leaving all of this behind and going and living in the woods, fucking do it. If this means creating art, do that. You don't have to do what I say. You don't have to do what your parents say. You don't have to do what society tells you to do. So think about that. Think about how you want to live. And always remember, you can make a change at any point. Okay. So what do you think about this view? Any thoughts, questions, concerns? Yes, no, maybe so. Yeah.
I'll say it makes me uneasy because I grew up as a Lutheran, and that perspective on God is something that is very, very different from any Protestant religion, especially in the West.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's weird. It's got this weird mysticism to it, you know. Yeah, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, it just makes me feel like, I think, especially growing up in Protestant churches, you're told that questioning things is also not good. Like, you're not supposed to question. You're supposed to
Right.
just listen and believe. So thinking about questioning in any way, like, even though I've kind of been trying to deconstruct from what I learned when I was younger as a child being in a religion, it's still like just so ingrained in me not to question that it's
Right. Yeah, it can be scary. I mean, we're all conditioned to think and do certain things in our lives, right? We're told we'll be punished if we don't do something, or if we do something. Yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, it definitely makes me a little uneasy, but I like it because I kind of hold like my own personal view of religion. That like, as I like get older and like learn more, it definitely changes.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, and I like how it like puts together like the scientific stuff and like the more spiritual stuff, and I feel like that just more fits into like what I think I believe. And I think religion is something that makes people feel safer and gives them some comfort in their lives, and I don't
Sure.
think it should necessarily be something where you have to follow a rule book like he was saying. So I think it's cool. It gave me a lot to think about.
Is it liberating?
It is kind of, yeah.
Good. Good. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well then I'm out of here. That's how I'm going to use my free will. I will see you all on Wednesday. Come with any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Thank you.